Hello, my name is Edgar De Anda with Benibra Pest Control in Westlaco, Texas, and I'm listening to the world's #1 pest control training podcast, the Pest Geek Podcast with Frank Hernandez.
This edition of the Pest Geek Podcast is brought to you by Pest Routes. Pest Routes, supercharge your company with Pest Routes, the #1 pest control software to help you dominate your goals. Visit them at pestroutes.com and get your free demo.
Pull out your hose and grab your can. We're about to integrate another Pest Geek podcast. Hi, everybody. Frank Hernandez here, and welcome to the Pest Geek podcast, bringing you the latest information on pests, products, and politics from today's leading industry sources to help you start, manage, and grow your pest control business.
Hey, welcome back. Welcome back to another edition of the Pest Geek podcast. I am Frank Hernandez, your Pest Geek, here discussing all things pest. We want to remind our audience to join in on the revolution. That's right, join in on the conversation, be part of the society. Pest Geek Podcast Listeners Group on Facebook. And we're on YouTube, we're on the web, pestgeekpodcast.com. Check out there the notes, everything that we put into the podcast. They're all on there. And here is Stephen Van Tassel with today's topic.
Thanks, Frank. Stephen Van Tassel here, wildlife control consultant. Hey, I wanted to talk today about helping your clients understand when they need to act. Sometimes when customers are calling, they're wondering, they see a raccoon in the backyard and they're worried about the safety of the children. Well, I used to get a lot of these types of calls when I was doing field work back in Massachusetts. People would call about a raccoon they saw go through the yard, and they were worried about the children. So I would give them a price, and all of a sudden they would say, well, the children, why isn't the city taking care of this? And I would sometimes ask them, aren't your taxes high enough? And then once they realized that they had to pay personally for this type of work, the children became magically safe. So the reality is that sometimes that people think something is a danger if they think they can get a service done for free, but once they have to pay for it, they realize they didn't need it after all. And the reality is they didn't. That people have to realize that there are raccoons cruising through their yard on probably a regular basis, and they just happened to see one. So just because an animal is out during the day that's typically nocturnal doesn't necessarily mean that the raccoon or skunk is necessarily diseased. Could be, but there's no guarantee of that because there's a lot of particular reasons why an animal may be moving around. For example, female raccoons during the summer, sometimes they get tired of the young and they get hot and they'll actually come out onto a tree branch and just hang out. Maybe the female needs to go to a new area to move her young. And sometimes you don't know if an animal's been disturbed from its den and it's leaving that location in broad daylight, not because it wants to, but simply because the conditions that it was under were too intolerable, it felt threatened, and it needed to move on. So the point is that how do you help people understand when they need to act? When is it appropriate to call a wildlife control professional to come and remove an animal? This is where we have to get into the issue of animal behavior. And so a lot of people tend to think that, well, it's a nocturnal animal like a raccoon, it's out during the daytime, therefore it must be rabid. Not true. And certainly I hope none of the listeners of this particular podcast try to exploit that concept, that mythology, because it's simply not true. Now, it could be true, but there's no guarantee of that. And again, I gave you some illustrations earlier as to why that would be the case. But there is a situation when an animal looks like it's trembling, shaking, walking in circles, disoriented. It looks unhealthy by the way it's limping, perhaps. Excuse me. It may also be a situation where the raccoon or the skunk is simply, looks like it has crustiness in its eyes. those are examples of when an animal needs to be removed by a professional, because it's acting sick. Now, simply understand that many times an animal is approaching humans because someone else has been conditioning that animal with human food. And the dirty secret in terms about so-called rabbit attacks, the mythological raccoon that's hunting people down to bite them. The reality is that most human exposures to rabies are human initiated. And what that means is that it's not that the animal was chasing the human down. It was that the human was chasing the animal down. Typically, it's a person who says, well, I thought it was ill. I needed to go over and help it. And I'll put that in air quotes for you. And then when they are approaching the animal that close, the animal lunges out and bites them. But it wasn't the animal hunting the person down. It was that the person didn't leave the animal alone. So the rule is, if you care, leave them there. And that should be the primary rule for all of us in this particular business. We shouldn't be in the business of hyping fear where people aren't learning to live with wildlife in their particular area, and understanding that a lot of animals have adapted to human-impacted conditions, that's urbanized, suburbanized areas, and they're doing quite well, actually. But if an animal is exhibiting aggression where it is chasing, that does happen. It's not common, but it does happen. Then that animal needs to be removed and people need to be kept away from it. Dogs need to be kept away from animals. Likewise, people need to be taught to leave animals alone. Now, here's a classic example of possums, for instance. Possums, sometimes when they're scared, they hunker down and they don't move. Oftentimes, they'll just sit there and they will bare their teeth and just stare at you, and people will think that the animal is sick. What I tell people when they have a possum in their yard and it's just on a fence staring there, is I tell them to leave the possum alone, remove the dog, remove the kids, remove everyone around. If the possum is still there 12 hours later or the next day, then the possum needs to be removed. But oftentimes possums get so paralyzed with fear, they decide, hey, I don't think I can run away safely. And rather than being attacked from behind where I may not be able to see my enemy, I'm going to just sit here and bare my teeth at them. People don't understand that when a possum is that frightened, it just hunkers down and stays there. So what people need to do is remove their dogs, leash their dogs, pull the dogs away, and that possum will feel safe again and move along. 90% of the time, that is actually what will happen in that situation. So if a situation is where where they don't have control, then that possum needs to be removed, not because the possum is sick, but because now it's because it's a people problem. And that's one of the things you're going to find in this industry, is many times it's not the wildlife that's the problem. When we're dealing with these transient animal situations, it's a people problem. And the animal has to lose. Why? Because people do crazy things. Snakes would be another classic example. I'm always shocked at the number of people, see it on Facebook all the time, it's really pathetic, where they kill the snake and then say, well, what was it? Well, it never seems to occur to them that maybe they should wait to identify the snake before they kill it. But that doesn't seem to be in the mental capacity of many people, because their first response is, it scares me, I'm going to kill it, therefore, and then find out what it is. And you find out it's a garter snake. Or the ubiquitous, everything in the South is a cottonmouth, or it's a copperhead. You would think that the place was wall-to-wall copperheads, the way people talk about snakes down there. The reality is that these animals, if you leave them alone, you'll be fine. And I know that everyone's worried about the children. The fact of the matter is your family car is going to be more dangerous than a lot of these snakes. So the reality is that we need to help our clients understand that there's a balance here, that there's You can't have, you have to learn how to overcome some of these phobias. I recommend people go to therapy. Go get some therapy. Work through your issues. But just because you're afraid of something doesn't mean you should just go over and kill it. And I'm not saying that people need to have snakes in their houses. That's not what I'm suggesting. But these people are often killing stuff that they're finding far away from their houses. It's just, I know a person, if he sees a snake, he'll go after it to kill it. Really? Seems kind of like there's a psychological problem there. Something a person needs to work at. Make sure you, as you're in your company, don't reinforce those types of mythologies. So let's summarize where we're at. Number one, if you care, leave them there. So your clients need to understand just because they see an animal walking through the yard doesn't mean they need to call you up, hire you to come out there and do it. Can they do that? Sure. But for what purpose? So you remove that raccoon, you remove that possum, then what? It would be better to simply remove the conditions. Maybe there's a bird feeder that needs to be modified. Maybe you need to stop feeding your dog and cat outside. Maybe you need to secure your shed and deck so that the animals can't live underneath there. Maybe you need to talk to your neighbor who's throwing food all over the place and is becoming an attraction for a wide variety of animals. A lot of people think they're being compassionate to these animals, and then lo and behold, you have distemper move in, and all these raccoons that they thought were awesome there, all of a sudden they transmit distemper to each other and they're all dead. We need to be sure that we are not reconfirming these particular phobias and bad behavior among the public. We need to be there for serious issues of home invasion by wildlife. We need to help people understand that there are sometimes conditions that they can change to reduce the attractiveness of their property to wildlife if that is something that they are concerned about. Number two, just because you see an animal out during daylight doesn't mean the animal is sick. Could be, but you need to ask more information. Was the animal acting normally? And I mean something more than time. You can't identify rabies by looking at your watch or whether the sun is outside. Is the animal acting normally in the sense, does it have a normal gait? Is it moving with purpose, or is it wandering around in circles? Is it stumbling? Does it look like it's limping? Does it seem to be wandering around with no apparent purpose? Is it shaking like it has tremors or Parkinson's disease? Any of those types of symptoms and behaviors tells you that something is wrong. When you look at it, does the hair look all scruffy up? Does the eyes look like there's pus in it? I mean, I don't want you getting too close to it, but some people have very good vision. Binoculars can be helpful. But you can tell pretty quickly whether an animal is acting normally or abnormally beyond simply looking at your watch. Then the last thing is you have to help people understand that they need to work through some of their phobias. Most exposures, most animal bites are not caused by the animal chasing the human down. They're caused by the human approaching the animal. In fact, that's even true for snake bites. Most snake bites, venomous snake bites, occur by people who are pet owners of venomous snakes. And believe it or not, alcohol happens to be involved with many of these situations. What a shock. Other times you'll have situations where people are either snake handling. Sometimes there was a minister several years ago, I believe might have been West Virginia, or it might have been Tennessee. He got killed handling a rattlesnake, and he died. So if we avoid some of these situations and we teach people, leave well enough alone, give it time, a lot of these situations self-resolve. And again, I'm not referring to situations where there's a rattlesnake inside of your house. I'm talking about things in the backyard, out in the woods, letting things be, okay? And where people need to learn how to live near wildlife, where the first default position doesn't just kill it. That is important, because sometimes when people who are not professionals are out interacting with some of these animals, people get hurt. But before I leave you today, I wanted to talk a little bit about coyotes, because it was an interesting project, analysis done by Dr. Robert Tim And this particular individual was published in a book by by an article by Dr. Schmidt. Let me read the entire reference for you. It's R.H. Schmidt, that's SCHMIDT, and R.M.Tim, that's spelled with two M's, TIMM. It's a 2007 article entitled Bad Dogs, Why Do Coyotes and Other Canids Become Unruly? Proceedings of the 12th Wildlife Damage Management Conference, edited by D.L. Nolte, W.M. Marjo, and D.H. Stallman. So that's the 2007 article, Bad Dogs in the 12th Wildlife Damage Management Conference. And what they did was they evaluated some research that was done by somebody else who was collecting, that is, how do you understand coyote aggression? As coyotes have now basically dispersed across the vast majority of the United States, there are still some areas where they're not that common. But for by and large, they are, almost coast to coast here in the United States and even north to south, by and large. When is it appropriate? What are the signs that tell you the point at which a coyote is at risk of attacking a human? Now, I'm not trying to create here hysteria that, every coyote's out to attack people. That's simply not true. But what was found over the years is that there's a pattern of behavior, a progression of aggression that gives us clues how far along that coyote is before it begins to attack people. And this work was done out of California, which has had coyotes for scores of years. And there was a long time where people weren't necessarily killing them or shooting them and what have you, and they were learning that over time that the coyotes began to change their behavior and became more aggressive. And so what they said is, it's sort of like you may have heard people that said, when they've been caught being a murderer or something, and they say, well, how did you get here? And they'll usually say, well, I started out pulling the legs off of a spider, and then they moved on to beating up neighborhood kids, and then they did this. And so there's a progression of greater and greater aggression. And the idea is that what's the trigger point with which you say, this coyote needs to go? When is it time to act? Because you don't want to just be killing every coyote, because every coyote's aggressive to a rabbit. That's no big deal. The question is where in the path is that coyote going to be aggressive to people, and when do you initiate action? And this is typically done on a community basis. When does the community decide, okay, we're gonna hire a professional to come in and shoot this coyote, trap this coyote, and use tools that may have been illegal otherwise, but we're going to give them an exclusion, a permit to use some of these tools because that coyote's becoming a threat to human health and safety. And these are the progressive steps that they found. And I'm going to read them in order of ascending aggression. In other words, the farther down this list I get, the more aggressive the coyote is becoming. It's on the path of ultimately biting a human. So the first clue is increase in coyotes on the streets and in the yards at night. So that's your first sign. The second sign, the next level of aggression, is the increase in coyotes approaching adults and or taking of pets at night. What that means is the coyotes are starting to attack cats and dogs. The third level of aggression is coyotes on the streets and in parks and yards early in the morning and the afternoon. So it starts at night, but then over time, the coyotes get a little bit more comfortable and they start attacking, they start being more noticeable around what we call the crepuscular time, which is early morning and dusk. So dusk and dawn are the two times. When it's getting darker, it's not completely light out. It's that in-between time before full daylight and full darkness. Crepuscular. A lot of animals are crepuscular. Level 4 is coyotes chasing or taking pets in daytime. So before they were attacking pets at night, now they've turned to reports of taking pets during the daytime. That's level 4. Level 5, coyotes attacking and taking pets on a leash or near owners, chasing joggers, bicyclists, and other adults. That's level 5. Level 6, coyotes seen in and around children's play areas, school grounds, and parks in midday. And the final level of aggression, coyotes acting aggressively toward adults in midday. So that you can see how these coyotes would be getting more and more familiar, more and more aggressive toward humans at this particular point. So the question is, what is the trigger point? At what stage should a community begin to intercede and act to remove those aggressive coyotes? And the authors basically suggested it was at level 4, when the coyotes began chasing or taking pets in daytime. That is when the community should act. So I hope that you may never deal with coyotes in your business. It's a kind of a niche market. But my point here is that it's important for us to think about what is an appropriate trigger point for certain animal behavior. And it's important for you to think about that. You're driving around from job to job. What is the trigger point? A lot of you insect people out there that are controlling bugs, there are trigger points. Some trigger points is, one cockroach, bring out the big guns, kill them all. Other situations are a little bit more complicated, and what is the trigger point with which you begin to spray? I mean, obviously, one mosquito the trigger point? Probably not. But what is that trigger point? Well, the same thing in wildlife. You want to be thinking about what is the reasonable trigger point to act. Because if we are going to share this planet with animals, because there is some benefit with having them around, if nothing more than aesthetic pleasure, we can't just be going around killing everything because someone somewhere might be bothered by it. That's just simply not appropriate. So what is that trigger point? And it's important for you as a professional to help your clients sometimes deal with their phobias, even at the expense of your bottom line. And this is the difference between an ethical and responsible PCO or WCO and just someone who is out being a hitman for hire, no matter what they're doing. And I hope that you're not just simply doing that. You have an important job to help protect human health and safety, to protect property. Don't lower those standards just to help reinforce people's phobias, because some of them can't work through some of their issues. Think about where that level is for you. And if you do happen to deal with coyotes, this is an article that you'll want to keep in your back pocket or available so that when you're talking with the community, you can tell them that there is some research, some historical research over coyote behavior over time. So I hope today this helps you understand when you should act with wildlife, helping your client understand when they need to leave well enough alone and when they need to act, and as well as something for you to think about how you are what's your trigger point when you need to act on controlling an animal, or when you think you should tip your client in that particular direction. All right. I'm Stephen Van Tassel, Wildlife Control Consultant. Back to you, Frank.
We hope you have enjoyed this edition of the Pest Geek Podcast. Until next time, have a pestacular day.
Thank you for listening to the Pest Geek Podcast. If you have enjoyed the Pest Geek Podcast, please give us a rating, write a review, or subscribe to the channel. You can join the Pest Geek Society by visiting pestgeekpodcast.com. Thank you for listening. See you next time.